The MCAT Podcast, session number 111. A collaboration between the medical school headquarters and Next Step Test Prep. The MCAT Podcast is here to make sure you have the information you need to succeed on your MCAT test day. We all know that the MCAT is one of the biggest hurdles you'll face as a pre-med, and we're here to give you the motivation and information that you need to know to help get you the score you deserve so you can one day call yourself a physician. Welcome to the MCAT Podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, your host here every week, where I am joined by one person from Next Step Test Prep. I always used to say Brian, but since Brian is no longer with Next Step Test Prep, we have the amazing Clara to fill his giant shoes. And if you ever met Brian in person, they are really big shoes. But we are continuing our breakdown of Next Step Test Prep full length 10. This week we are still in cars, and for the next several weeks we are doing the cars section, breaking down a passage every week. Don't forget to follow along in the show notes, the specific blog post for this episode, where you can download the handout that we have and you can follow along with us. And for cars passages, it may be helpful for you. So let's go ahead and say hello to Clara and jump in. All right, Clara, back for week 3 of you now as the amazing co-host of the MCAT podcast. I hope you are having as much fun as I am.
I am. I'm really into it.
All right. And cars, obviously, not the easiest thing to jump into. That's like bringing in a relief pitcher, bottom of the 9th, with 2 outs, and I don't know this analogy I'm going for, but it's just a really high-pressure situation that you came into, and I think you're crushing it. So let's go ahead, and we'll continue here with passage 3 from Next Step Test Prep Full Length 10.
All right, this is a tricky one, so we'll see how it goes. Passage 3. Free will, the ability to actively choose among possible behaviors, has proven one of philosophy's most persistent difficulties and important concepts. Given its direct linkage with responsibility, many are loath to accept the deterministic view that free will is little more than illusion. Compatibilism, or soft determinism, accepts the core tenets of determinism but holds that free will still exists. Determinism is couched in several different terms, most commonly causal determinism and logical determinism. That is, causal determinism asserts that every single event or effect has a cause that preceded it, and that those causes could not have possibly resulted in any different effect. The universe is seen as a vast, almost incomprehensibly complicated machine, ticking along with no room for human choice. Any behavior a person might exhibit is an effect of an earlier cause, and that behavior could not have possibly happened differently. Logical determinism is a closely related concept about the truth state of propositions in the future tense. This view asserts that the sentence, "it will rain tomorrow," is either necessarily true today or necessarily false. The fact that a weatherman can only say, "there's a 75% chance of rain tomorrow," reflects a frailty of human understanding rather than an indeterminacy in the universe itself. All right, that's only the first paragraph.
And my brain has already exploded.
It's a dense one. These philosophy passages.
How do you break down such a dense paragraph like this?
Yeah, so a couple things to note. First is when you see a passage that's this dense, a lot of times students will just freak out.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I did.
Yeah.
And I'm not even taking the MCAT.
Well, I've been there too. But the key is to accept that you don't have to understand every word you're reading as you're reading through it this first time. Because for example, the questions can't possibly ask about everything, right? It's not like you have to understand exactly what every word is saying. And often, if you try to understand everything that's going on in a dense passage like this, you'll end up reading and rereading the same sentence over and over and not really getting anything out of it, and then your passage will take too long. So instead, what I recommend is read through the passage, accept that maybe it'll be a little bit dense, maybe you're not sure exactly what's going on, but just keep moving through it and highlight as you encounter these key terms. So here we actually have a lot of different concepts coming up, right? We have a lot of sort of definitions of concepts. We have free will, we have determinism. They mentioned compatibilism or soft determinism, so those are the same thing. And then finally, they mentioned logical determinism. So even just highlighting each of those things can be really helpful because it's really likely that one or even like more of the questions will ask about one of those terms, right? So if they ask about logical determinism, we can be like, oh, hey, there, I highlighted logical determinism. I'll be able to go back to it.
Okay.
All right.
You talk a lot about highlighting. What about with our wet erase pen and little laminated sheets of paper?
Definitely. Yeah, the note takers out there, your approach will be a little bit different, but it'll get at the same core understanding, right? So in particular, something to keep in mind for a passage like this is not to write out like whole words, right? So you definitely want to do the same thing. You want to say, okay, free will is this first sentence, free will, ability to choose. They mention free will has a direct linkage with responsibility, and that's really key, this direct linkage. That's a very strong statement. So you might write free will or like FW, and then like equals like direct linkage, responsibility, but you'd abbreviate all these words, right? You don't want to be writing out logical determinism on your wet erase board.
Okay.
Yeah, so in effect, same thing. And that's one advantage of highlighting too. If you're a note taker, you really benefit from the note taking approach. You don't want to deviate from that. But if you are a highlighter, it can really help in a passage like this because you don't have to write out a lot of long language.
Okay.
All right. Second paragraph and final. Compatibilism asserts that while both of these forms of determinism are valid, free will, properly understood, still exists. The main focus here is only construing free will in a sense under which one has the freedom to act without outside compulsion, according to one's own motives and goals, rather than under some coercion or other threat. This kind of political liberty is constructed as a non-metaphysical concept focused more on definite relations between people rather than on complex attributions of pre-existing brain states. That is, one is not held responsible for action X if one literally has a gun being pointed at one's head with another person saying, do X or I shoot. Here, there is neither political liberty nor any sort of free will. However, if there is no threat of violence, no law, and no political compulsion to carry out action X, and if a person chooses to consider whether or not to do X and then ends up doing X, the person had political liberty over the choice and thus had free will in choosing to do X and is therefore responsible for the action and its direct consequences. All right.
Okay.
It's pretty intense, but there's our passage right there.
Yeah. And so I would be very likely to just go C, move on. Because I'm like, I didn't understand a word of anything that was being said there. So that's just the way my mind thinks, but we'll see what stuck and maybe what didn't based on the questions. So question 14. If it could be proven via quantum mechanics that the universe has phenomena that can lead to two different possible outcomes given exactly the same starting conditions, then A, soft determinism would be a more accurate representation of reality than determinism. B, at least causal determinism and probably also logical determinism would be less likely to be true. C, the passage author's argument about the proper definition of free will would be weakened. And D, it can be concluded that the neurological and psychological processes underlying human behavior are not deterministic. Wow. All right, so we can prove that you have two outcomes based on the same starting conditions. And so I would go back up to causal determinism in the first paragraph asserts that every single event or effect had a cause that preceded it and that those causes could not have possibly resulted in any different effect. So that's just jumped out at me. I remembered you reading that, and that's causal determination. And answer choice B is at least causal determination and probably also logical determinism would be less likely to be true. So that kind of stands out to me without even looking at or re-looking at what logical determinism is again. And so I would probably just go with B for that reason.
Yeah, and you're right.
Awesome. Okay.
So that tactic worked here, and it's actually not a bad approach, right? Because this is a dense passage. Maybe you spent a long time reading it and you're running out of time or something like that. Or if this were not the last passage in a section, then your time might be better spent on a passage that is a little bit easier to understand. So if an answer like B stands out as seeming clearly right away, there's no reason not to just pick it. What I would recommend is flagging that question. So in the actual system, if you were taking a test, flagging, which is a new word for marking questions. So if you had a little bit of extra time at the end, you could go back and check. But yeah, go with B, and you're totally right.
Awesome. Okay.
All right. And then in terms of the other answers here, because B looked good, and if we went back to logical determinism, which was the other part of B, we'd see that it's pretty closely related to causal determinism, so B makes sense. But the other answer choices just don't work as well. So A says soft determinism would be a more accurate depiction of reality. But if we were to go back to soft determinism, which is in the beginning of the first paragraph, we see that soft determinism, it says, accepts the core tenets of determinism. So this question stem undermined determinism. Well, it's going to undermine soft determinism too. Mm-hmm. So A is wrong. And then C talks about the author's argument about the proper definition of free will, and that's not even in this passage. Yeah, the author mentions free will, but if we were to just glance back up there, we don't see any argument, right? We don't see some argument about, oh, here's the right definition of it, and here's some other wrong definition.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's out of scope. And then D is just crazy. It's talking about the neurological and psychological processes. Yeah, that is not anywhere in this passage. We don't want to get tempted to pick it because it's complicated. B is our answer here.
Okay. Yeah, I like that last tempted to pick it because it's complicated. A lot of students would be like, they must be trying to trick me, so it has to be this one because I have no clue what that is, and so that must be it.
Yeah, that is very common. But yeah, if an answer choice makes no sense, don't pick it for that reason. That is the opposite of the reason to pick it. Because, yeah, the test is generally not trying to trick you, not trying to get you all confused.
Okay.
All right. I'll read the next one. So, 15. The author implies that A, any philosopher who thinks responsibility must depend on free will holds a non-deterministic view of the universe. B, a person who is forced to carry out an action would not be held responsible for that action under any ethical framework. C, responsibility is of lesser concern to determinists than to compatibilists. And D, if determinists have a definition of responsibility that is applicable in the real world, it must not depend on free will.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's rough.
Yeah. So answer choice A, any philosopher who thinks responsibility must depend on free will holds a non-deterministic view of the universe. And so I'd have to go back to where non-determinism is talked about to try to figure out. And I don't know if it is specifically. Do they talk about non-determinism, or is it all determinism? And we have to assume that non-determinism is separate from
that. They never mention non-determinism. Yeah. So we have to assume, okay, non-determinism is just
that's
anything
free will.
outside of this deterministic view.
Okay. So any philosopher who thinks responsibility must depend on free will holds a non-deterministic view of the universe. Okay, so possibly answer choice A. Answer choice B, a person who is forced to carry out an action would not be held responsible for that action under any ethical framework. And so they had the whole second paragraph talking about if you're forced to do X, literally being with a gun held to your head, then there's neither political liberty nor any sort of free will. But he's not saying that you're not held responsible under any action for that action under any ethical framework. So I don't know if that's it. Responsibility is of lesser concern to the determinists than the compatibilists, and compatibilists are those soft determinism people. So they're kind of the same thing. although there's free will with the determinists. So maybe there, because free will is included with compatibilists. And then D, if determinists have a definition of responsibility that is applicable in the real world, it must not depend on free will. I have no idea what that means. But so it's interesting. A few of these kind of stand out. The philosopher one kind of just stands out because everything is about determinism and not being free will. And if a philosopher thinks responsibility must depend on free will, then he obviously holds a non-deterministic view of the universe. So that one kind of just jumps out at me right away. So I'd probably choose A.
A is really tempting. It is.
Do you want me to tell you what my second choice would have been?
I do.
Okay, so my second choice would have been B. And that would still be wrong.
B is also wrong.
Darn it. Okay.
Yeah, so this is actually the weird one. So the answer to this one's actually D.
What?
Yeah.
All right.
It's so it's interesting, right? Because I think this might be a case where we saw A. A seemed so tempting that it kind of stood out, and it made us maybe pay like a little less attention to the later choices, especially by D. A lot of times by when a student gets to D, like your eyes are like all glazed over.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
although now that I'm reading A again, it says any philosopher, so it's going to that extreme. So I think kind of like in the previous episode where it was like every person has salmonella in their GI system. I don't think the author would imply that every philosopher who thinks responsibility must depend on free will holds a non-deterministic view of the universe. So maybe for that reason alone, I shouldn't have chosen A.
Yeah, the any is really strong there because when you see an extreme statement like that in an answer choice, you think, okay, like if for any reason something falls outside of this choice and that thing could exist, then the choice is wrong, right? Like maybe there's a philosopher who is just like an idiot, right? Like he's just really, he's totally wrong. He thinks responsibility depends on free will. He also holds a deterministic view, even though like it never said any good philosopher. So not that you should really think outside of the passage too much, like you shouldn't start thinking about these crazy scenarios, but that's just emphasizing, okay, if it's that extreme and the author didn't say it, be careful about picking that choice.
Okay.
Yeah, and then B is interesting, right? B was tempting too, but B is saying under any ethical framework. Mm-hmm. So that's the same thing. Like the passage doesn't cover every ethical framework ever, as far as we know. So there totally could be an ethical framework out there where a person who's forced to carry out an action would be held responsible for that action. So we don't want to pick B because, again, it's too strong.
It's funny. When I was going through the answers the first time, I said B wasn't right because he didn't say under any ethical framework. So I don't know why I mistakenly chose B as my backup answer. I was under pressure. I freaked out.
Oh, it happens. On the current MCAT testing interface, you can actually highlight words in the answer choices. So if you were actually going through these answer choices and you see those extreme words like any, you could be like, oh my God, or you can strike out individual words now too. So you could maybe see that word any, you could strike it out and be like, okay, when I look back at that choice, I'm not going to be tempted by it because I crossed out any.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then C, responsibilities of lesser concern to determinists than to compatibilists. Well, they didn't give us that sort of comparison, right? So we don't know who cares about responsibility. They did mention responsibility in the first paragraph, but they only mentioned it in passing, really, by saying that this free will has this direct linkage with responsibility, but we don't know who thinks it's more important. So then we're left with D. And D says, if determinists have a definition of responsibility, it must not depend on free will. And determinists, well, if we go back to that first paragraph, that's where it says the deterministic view is that free will is little more than an illusion.
Yep.
Yeah, and then it also says free will, earlier than that, free will has this direct linkage with responsibility. So, yeah, if a determinist thinks that responsibility is a concept that makes sense, but they think free will is an illusion, they're not going to think responsibility depends on free will. So D is perfect.
Okay, there you go. Question 16. Compatibilists would hold someone responsible for which of the following actions? So again, just before we jump in there, compatibilism is soft determination, accepts the core tenets of determinism, but also holds that free will exists, or still exists. So A man chooses to speed while driving to work because he is late and causes a near-fatal car accident, but the causes that made him late could not have resulted in any other possible outcome but his tardiness. B, a person lives in a society whose laws require all individuals to report possession of illegal drugs to the police. Thus, he reports his friend for possession, even though he doesn't want to and knows his friend will be punished. C, a hostage negotiator agrees to have a suitcase with a large sum of money delivered to a hostage taker because the hostage taker has demonstrated a willingness to kill innocent bystanders. Or D, a person engages in a distasteful act because she is told she will be killed if she fails to comply, even though she has never shown a weapon or given a direct reason to believe that the threat beyond the threat itself. Oh, all right. So compatibilists would hold someone responsible for which of the following actions? So compatibilists are saying that there is still free will. They would hold the person responsible. So it's weird. A kind of stands out to me. So free will. The man is late. He's speeding. He causes a near fatal car accident. But he's saying, but I would have been late. But free will existed, and so you could have chosen to be late, is what maybe I think the compatibilists are saying. So that's, I think I'm leaning towards A to begin with. Let's go to B. A person lives in a society whose laws require all individuals to report possession of illegal drugs. So when it's talking about laws, I think it goes against free will because they're saying the laws are there to exist. So I'm not sure B would count here. A hostage negotiator agrees to have a suitcase with a large sum of money delivered to a hostage taker. I don't know how any of that has to do with free will. D, a person engages in a distasteful act because she is told she will be killed if she fails to comply. And again, I'm not sure any of that kind of goes with where we're going. And so I would choose A. A
is right.
Woohoo! All right.
Yeah. Awesome. So
these are hard.
You're on a roll, yeah. So totally, these are tough, but this is actually one that has long answer choices, but was probably the answer you got to the fastest. So, yeah, so that's a really a good sign to us not to freak out when we see long answer choices like this. But yeah, so A is talking about this guy speeding. And then all the other answer choices are similar, right? So all the other answer choices are either talking about something, there being some sort of threat of violence, or there being some sort of force, or some sort of legal pressure to commit an activity. But A is just this man's choice. He chose to speed. He could have just not done that. So where we find direct support in the passage, too, is if we see near the end of the second paragraph, when they're talking about these compatibilists and what they think. They say if there is no threat of violence, no law, and no political compulsion to carry out an action, that's when we have this free will and this responsibility. And A is the only answer choice that doesn't have force, political compulsion, or a law.
There you go. Okay.
Awesome. All right. So we have one more here, number 17. So logical determinism differs from causal determinism in that A, only logical determinism is consonant with compatibilism. B, only logical determinism is incompatible with soft determinism. C, it can be demonstrated correct through deductive proof rather than scientific experimentation. And D, it is concerned with the present rather than future effects.
And I have no clue, based on how this question is worded and the answers. I would choose C and move on because my brain hurts at this point and I'm tired.
Yep, that's the natural response. But so C is wrong.
That's okay.
But,
I'll take that one.
Yeah, sometimes you have to know when to move on, right? That the time you're spending on a question like this, you could have enough time to answer 2 questions later on.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, so what I would do for a question like this is just really quickly say, okay, question stem deals with logical determinism and causal determinism. We can just go straight back to those terms. Either we highlighted them or we made a note in our notes that they're discussed in the first paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd go back to logical determinism first, and we see, okay, it's a closely related concept. They're saying, actually, it's a closely related concept to causal determinism. But then they say this concept is about the truth state of propositions in the future tense. So actually, if you just got to this point, and then you wanted to just pick an answer and move on, you would probably pick D, because D says the word future.
Mm-hmm.
And is talking about present versus future. And D is the right answer here. Yeah.
All right. That's easy. You don't have to know anything. Just find future.
Right. Totally. And, sometimes it is that easy. Like, you don't obviously want to just see a word in the passage and then pick an answer choice that matches that word. But if you're in a rush, that's a better tactic than picking some random other answer.
Mm-hmm.
And then in this case, for the actual reasoning behind why this answer is right, we see, if we just dig a little bit into this logical determinism, we see that they're saying that the sentence "it will rain tomorrow," well, that's either true or false right now. Like, it's either true, going to rain, or it's not going to rain. And they're saying it doesn't matter that we're talking about tomorrow. They're saying that when they say this fact that the weatherman can only sort of predict a 75% chance of rain is just a frailty of his understanding or her understanding. So logical determinists don't care about whether something's happening in the future or the present. They're saying no matter what, it's either true or false. We just don't know enough to know enough about the future.
Wow. That's like some Matrix Inception kind of mashup there.
Totally is.
All right, there you have it. Some more MCAT cars for you from Next Step Test Prep. Full length 10. Next Step has 10 at this time, 10 full-length exams that you can purchase to help you prepare for the MCATs. One of the best ways, one of the surefire ways to prepare for the MCAT, the best way possible, is by taking practice tests. Taking those practice exams, getting an understanding of what it's like to sit for 7.5 hours, getting an understanding of what it's like to read a passage, to read the questions, to time yourself, to give yourself the confidence that you are ready to go on your MCAT test day. The best way to do that is with practice exams. The AAMC sells a couple exams. Next Step Test Prep has 10. I encourage you to get the ones from the AAMC, and if you have some money left over, you can buy the ones from Next Step Test Prep. You can buy them in 4, 6, or 10 packages, and you can save 10% by using the promo code MCATPOD. That's MCATPOD. Go to nextsteptestprep.com. Again, the promo code MCATPOD, MCATPOD. That's all capital letters. Have a great week. We'll see you next time for more cars breakdowns.